LeighTDickey.com. Well, hello everybody, Leigh Dickey here. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. I am coming to you today from one of my many outdoor offices. I can turn anything into an outdoor office so long as I have somewhere to sit where I can take out all my gear, which is basically a small mic stand, my microphone, a cable that plugs directly into my phone, and I am good to go. I am right now sitting at a picnic table in front of this municipal office here in Toronto, because I do not like being chained to a desk. So if I can make this show mobile so that I can be comfortable and tell you guys a story and give you guys some insight on this show, on the Beats and Speaks podcast, then I'm good to go. And that's what we're doing right now. I am coming to you live, or well, not live, but I am recording this live as it happens at one of my many outdoor offices here at a municipal office in the city of Toronto while sitting at a picnic table. And today I want to give you guys some insight and a behind-the-scenes look at my interview with Kat Carter. Now, Kat Carter is a former radio broadcasting professional, having worked for stations such as Z95.3 out in Vancouver, 104.5 CHUM-FM, and Quinte Broadcasting in Belleville. We talked on the show. I had her on the show a few weeks back, and we talked about her journey in radio, theradionerd.com, which is her current project. She is currently the owner and founder of The Radio Nerd, where you can find anything and everything related to radio. Blogs on her time in the industry, microphones, headphones, you name it, radio plays. You can find anything and everything related to radio and Kat Carter at theradionerd.com. Of course, I will link all that below. We also talked about The Simpsons, because she is a big fan. And it was so cool to have her on the show. Like, she is the biggest guest in Beats and Speaks podcast history, and I am so lucky to have had her on the show, and so lucky that she was willing to come on the show and basically sit down and talk with me for the time that she did. But I want to give you guys a behind-the-scenes look. Before I get into that, though, I want to tell you where you can find this show, the Beats and Speaks podcast, and me, yours truly, Leigh Dickey. All right, so the Beats and Speaks podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and anywhere else. Everywhere podcasts are available. Also, we're on my official website, LeighTDickey.com. You can find us on YouTube as well under Leigh Dickey TV. Of course, all those links will be in the description. Follow me on social media. Subscribe and like. Leave us a review as well. You can leave reviews on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform and player of choice. You can also leave reviews on my official Facebook page, which is facebook.com/LeighTDickey. I will leave all those links in the description below. And if you want to be a guest on a future episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast, please email me at LeighTDickey, that's LeighTDickey @gmail.com, and we will set something up and go from there so you can find yourself, you can hear yourself on a future episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. All right, now that all that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get into this behind-the-scenes look at my interview with Canadian broadcasting legend Kat Carter. Okay, so how this interview with Kat Carter came together, I've wanted her on the show for a while. Even before I started having guests on the Beats and Speaks podcast, she was one of the interviews that I wanted. She was a guest that I wanted on this show. And, well, here's a bit of a little more of a behind-the-scenes tidbit. I have a list of people that I want to get on this show, and she was right at the top of that list. She was right up there. There were a few. That list is long, and it's getting ever longer, as I get into these interviews. But she was one of the guests that I really wanted on this show, and it was amazing to have her on the show. But in terms of how this interview came together, I reached out, gave her just basically an explanation as to who I was and what I thought we could do. Is in terms of I wanted to talk about her time in the industry, like in the radio industry. TheRadioNerd.com, obviously, because I think it's really cool, and she was a big fan of The Simpsons, so I wanted to talk about that too. And I reached out, I think on a Wednesday, sometime in I think it was late morning, maybe early afternoon, and she got back to me right away, and we set it up for the next day. I was so surprised that it came together that quickly. Like I said, even in the intro to her episode, which I think was episode 41, so you can go back in the archives and listen to the interview there. But even in the intro to her episode, I was surprised at how quickly this interview came together. And I was surprised that she even wanted to do the show, because I mean, she's been in on stations that are pretty major, like Z95.3 in Vancouver, which flipped back to Z95.3 from Virgin Radio Vancouver. She's worked for 104.5 CHUM-FM, and I'm just this guy that does a podcast, wants to hear people's stories and have them on. But when I reached out to somebody like her, I was like, okay, I knew, I was like, okay, well, she might not want to do this show, which is fine. She might not get back to me, which is fine. But I was so surprised that she wanted to do the show, and that she was so enthusiastic about doing the show, and that it came together so quickly. So we set this. I reached out on Wednesday. We set the interview up for the next day, and then we got to recording it. Now, when it came to recording this episode, it was a little more troubleshooting involved with that, because I'm in Toronto and she currently lives in Barbados, and it wasn't even like I figured, okay, we're gonna do this remotely because obviously I'm in Toronto, she's in Barbados, and I'm trying to hide my climate envy because in Barbados it's like 30 degrees right now, and as I sit here looking at the sign, it's probably reading about 11 or 12 Celsius. So it's cold here. Kat, if you're listening to this, or no, sorry, it's 9 degrees Celsius. Kat, if you're listening to this and you have a spare room, preferably as soon as possible, I'm gonna hop on a plane. But when it came to getting this together, I'm surprised it came together so quickly and that she wanted to do the show. But when it came to the technical aspect, obviously we were doing it remotely because I'm in Toronto and she's in Barbados. We used Zoom, I suppose the cloud meeting software, to record the interview, which is one of the two methods I use to record my shows or my interviews with people for the Beats and Speaks podcast. I figured it was going to be straightforward. I got up, set everything up, we were good to go. As long as the Wi-Fi held, everything was fine. It would have been fine. Nope. Because I'm a guy that really doesn't like to sit at my desk. Now, I've done interviews at my desk, at my main rig, which is what I've basically figured I'm going to have to do from now on. And I'm going to have to get up early enough to set everything up, because it does take a while for my main laptop to boot. And the same thing with the netbook that I use to basically record the interviews when I'm not at my desk. It does take a while for it to boot, so I'm going to have to figure out a solution there. But when it came to this interview, and it's through no fault of Kat's, I guess I can say it's through no fault of my own, but I still felt really bad because we would get into the interview. At first, I was sitting at my dining table, and I was connected to my Wi-Fi, had everything set up, everything was working, everything was perfect. And then about 15 minutes into the interview, like 10-15 minutes into the first attempt, my Wi-Fi dropped and the connection was lost, and we had to start again. So after about 10-15 minutes of doing that, I said, all right, let me move rooms and then we'll try and figure something out. I did move rooms. I moved from the dining table into my kitchen, and it was good, it was fine. But we got about 15-20 minutes into that attempt, and my Wi-Fi dropped out. So I moved from the kitchen back into my room. And I figured it's fine because it's right next to my router, no big deal, right? But I'm even finding that with my main rig, I'm having issues with my router, and that's my main setup. If I'm sitting at my desk in my room, and it's giving me all sorts of issues lately. I don't know why. But I was using my netbook, and I got back to my room, and the connection kept cutting out and dropping, and audio, you'd get like every second word, and it just wouldn't work. So I figured, okay, let's try going to the basement. Went to the basement. We got down there, and there were a couple times where I forgot to hit record, and that's on me. That's completely my fault. Oh brother, I couldn't believe it. Because what'll happen is, instead of recording everything, usually I will start the meeting, usually if I'm using Zoom, the software, to record a call or record an interview. I will start the meeting, and I have it set to record automatically, but I will start it usually, pause, and then wait for my guest to show up. But I had forgotten that we were doing a little preamble and just, settling into the interview before I'd actually hit record, and by the time I actually started asking questions, I had realized, and she started answering, I had realized that I forgot to hit record, and I had to stop her, and we had to start again. I felt so bad. I was so... I'm not even going to deny it. I was frazzled when it came to the many attempts that it took to get this interview recorded. But she was so patient, and she exercised more patience than I really had the right to ask anybody to exercise. Because, we were, with all the technical mishaps and the Wi-Fi connections dropping, and this is in my home too. I was recording my half from the house. I was recording this from my house, and with all the connection drops and what have you, and the Wi-Fi basically not connecting at all at some points, that whole thing took about 2 hours, maybe 2 hours and 15 minutes, and I basically said, I think we both agreed that, well, why don't we reschedule, because it's obviously not working, and which is fine. And I had a second interview that day at later that night at about 6 p.m. Eastern time. And I said, listen, why don't we, or, I have this second interview and I have to go through it anyhow. So why don't I tell you how it goes and get in touch with you after the interview was over and just basically tell you how it went. And she agreed, and then we rescheduled right after it wouldn't, our initial attempts would not work. So I said, well, how's about, I think our initial interview was 11 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, and by the time we agreed to reschedule after all the connection mishaps, it was 1 in the afternoon. So it was just after about 1 o'clock, maybe 1:15, something like that. So I said, well, how's 8 o'clock? And that would work, and it did work, thankfully, finally, because I actually was out of the house at that point, because that second interview I had initially scheduled for 6 o'clock went off without a hitch. I was at Starbucks. Not that far from my house, and that interview went off no problem. It went off without a hitch. It was great, and I figured, I emailed Kat right away and said, hey, Wi-Fi seems to be holding here much better than the Wi-Fi in my house. My internet service provider will get a lashing at some point, because I'm running into more issues with it all these, a few weeks later, and it's really becoming a pain. But I digress. That second interview I had initially scheduled at 6 o'clock was fine. It went off great. It was recorded fine, and I emailed Kat, said, hey, we're good to go for 8 o'clock if you're still up for it. And she was. We managed to get through it. I think the whole thing took about 45 minutes. We, talked a little, there was a little preamble and things like that, but I am so happy to have had Kat's interview recorded, have had her on the show, and I'm so happy that she was so patient with me when it came to all those technical issues earlier that day. There's more patience than I really can ask of somebody, or should have asked of somebody. So Kat, thank you for being so patient. I will give you whatever you want if you ever come back to Toronto for anything. You hit me up, and whatever you want, it's all yours. my firstborn child, whatever you want, I will give it. I'll give you anything. Thank you for being so patient, and thank you for agreeing to be on the show. And I still, even these weeks later, I feel really bad for, basically having her sit there while I try and figure this out. And I couldn't figure out what was going on with my Wi-Fi. It just was dropping in and out constantly. And it's not like I haven't had that happen before, but I haven't had that happen for that length of time, that many times, ever. So I was ticked off. I was upset, but I was surprised that it kept happening. I couldn't understand why, and I really just didn't get it. I still don't get it, all these weeks on, but it is what it is. And Kat was patient enough to stick it out with me, and I'm glad that we reconnected later that day and we got that interview recorded, because it is one of my favorite interviews, and she is the biggest guest in Beats and Speaks podcast history. So Kat, if you're listening to this, thank you for being so patient. Thank you for agreeing to come on the show. Thank you for sticking it out with me while we got it recorded and everything. Just thank you for sticking with me through all the technical issues, all the technical difficulties. And if you ever want to come back, there's always going to be a spot for you on the Beats and Speaks podcast. I will always have a spot for you here. But all the technical difficulties aside, Kat was a fantastic guest. It was a fantastic interview. I loved having her on the show. And I'm honestly hoping that I don't have any issues like that again, where my connection keeps dropping even when I'm right next to the router, and then having to move rooms. I don't ever want to have to do that again. It was a real pain. But of course, I don't know whether that's somebody just going, like, poking at me, whether it's like a podcast god or whatever you want to call it, or it's just somebody going, yeah, pull it back a little bit, kid. We got to keep you humble somewhat, right? But that's the story of the interview with Kat Carter and the behind the scenes look. I love talking to her about her time in the industry, the RadioNerd.com, The Simpsons, and it was fun. It was a lot of fun for me. I really wanted to have her on the show, and I got to talk to her for 35, 40 minutes, something like that. Or, 35, 40 minutes in the interview, but if you count all the mishaps, it's probably closer to like 2 or 3 hours. So I'm forever grateful for Kat Carter for wanting to come on the Beats and Speaks podcast, for being so patient and sticking it out with me through all the technical difficulties. So again, Kat, if you're listening to this, thank you for everything. You were fantastic. And if you ever want to come back and do another episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast, my door is always open and my inbox is always on. But that is the story of my interview with Kat Carter, the behind the scenes look. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please comment, like, share, and subscribe. You can find the Beats and Speaks podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and my official website, LeighTDickey.com. We're also on YouTube. Search for Leigh Dickey TV. You can follow me on social media. All the links will be below. Find Kat Carter at theradionerd.com, at Kat Radio on Instagram, at The Radio Nerd on Facebook and Instagram. Of course, I will link everything below. You should really go follow Kat Carter if you are a lover of all things radio. She was the best, and I loved having her on. It was just a fantastic time. But there it is, a behind-the-scenes look at my interview with Canadian broadcasting legend and owner and founder of theradionerd.com, Kat Carter. Again, please comment, like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you on next Friday for a brand new episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. All right, I have been your host, Leigh Dickey, and this has been another episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. But for right now, I'm signing off. We'll see you all and talk to you all later. Talk to you all next Friday for a brand new episode of the Beats and Speaks podcast. All right, Leigh Dickey signing off. Peace. LeighTDickey.com